So, on behalf of the York County Historical Committee, I welcome you to our program this afternoon. Before we get started, I wish to invite you to a special event today. The unveiling of a new exhibit honoring the Marquis de Lafayette will be held in York County Historical Museum in the basement of the building immediately following the program. You just go down to the lobby, off to your left or straight across as you come down the stairs if you choose to take the stairs. The elevator will take you down to the museum. And there are memorabilia related to Lafayette, and we will have cookies and lemonade served down there if you so choose. All right, now today's program. Our presentation is jointly sponsored by the York County Historical Committee and the York County Historical Museum. It's also in association with the Virginia 250 Committee, a statewide and local endeavor to celebrate the 250-year anniversaries of revolutionary events from 1774 to 1783. We're fortunate to have with us today actor, historian, and interpreter Mark Schneider for a portrayal of the Revolutionary War hero, the Marquis de Lafayette, which I am reminded was also appointed a major general in the American Army during the Revolution. This timely presentation marks the approach of the 250th anniversary of Lafayette's return to America in 1824 as guest of the nation, in which he visited all 24 states and all surviving presidents. Mark was born and raised in Setauket, New York, hope I pronounced that correctly, to a French mother and an American father. He has a lifelong fascination with French military history, which is how he became interested in Marquis de Lafayette. After receiving a BA in history from Christopher Newport University, Mark served in the U.S. Army. Since his military service, he has worked for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, where he has written, directed, and performed in a variety of performances that cover the extensive history of Lafayette. And now I will turn the floor and the microphone over to Marquis de Lafayette as portrayed by Mark Schneider. Please welcome him.
Bonjour, citoyens! Mesdames et messieurs, citoyens du monde, mesdames et messieurs, gentlemen and ladies, my dear friends, please do allow me an introduction. The name is General Lafayette, though I believe that most of you, no doubt, know me far better by my name of the Ancien Régime, the old order, the Révolution here in America, and that, of course, is Marie-Joseph Poivron-Chelbet de Motier, le Marquis de Lafayette. Would you like to repeat that, monsieur? What a pleasure and honor it is to see all of you here on this simply magnificent day. How it is hard to believe it is already the 19th day of October of this year 1824. But nonetheless, a day of celebration, is it not? You know, I will always love you, Americans. For in reality, you have no idea of what I am celebrating. Yet most of you are willing to celebrate right along with me. You know, I think that is a credit to the American people, how very optimistic you are, or simply in want of a party. Well, how could you know, my dear friends, for I, General Lafayette, have only recently returned back to America after 40 long years. Indeed, friends, the last time I set foot upon American soil was just after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which of course occurred in September of 1783. So thus I returned in 1784 to celebrate with all of you, my beloved brothers and sisters here in America. But my friends, even though 40 years have passed, we must never forget how that independence was in fact achieved. For all of those brave soldiers, sailors, and Marines alike, who have fought and bled upon countless battlefields, let us applaud them all! Well, my friends, I have returned, courtesy of your very own President of these United States, Monsieur James Monroe, to be what he is calling a guest of the nation, to tour all 24 United States and territories. Can you imagine, Monsieur? 24. Do you realize the last time I was here you had but 13? Oh, goodness, at this rate you'll have as many as 50 one day. Could you imagine, madame? Well, like so many adventures, mine began in New York City on the 16th day of August of this year, 1824, in front of 80,000 inhabitants. Can you imagine that, madame? What a joy it was. And after some sightseeing and visiting different places there within the city of Manhattan, I traveled northwards in the upper part of the state of New York to Boston, where, of course, I met with John Adams, your second president of the United States. You know, it was he and Thomas Jefferson who once said of me that I had a canine appetite for popularity. Oh, I'm not quite sure how to interpret that so well. But nonetheless, then southwards, I went to Philadelphia City. I went to that place where you declared for independence. In fact, I referred to it as Independence Hall. I hope that name will stick. Then onwards to Baltimore City, and then, of course, to the Federal City, where I met with the President and thanked him for this kind invitation. But, of course, my dear friends, today is the 19th of October, the day in which we celebrate the greatest victory in the war, the victory over Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown! You know, after landing off the York River, and I saw all of you gathered there, of course, I saw a dear friend from the war. That man was named James Armistead Lafayette. Do you know he was a slave during the war? He was the property of William Armistead. But when I had met James, I soon discovered that he was a rather intelligent man, a resourceful man, and I requested of his master that he might be put in my service. Well, when James came to my tent, he said, Monsieur le Marquis, I am pleased that you wish my service, but I am no soldier. I have never fired a musket before. I am not very good with a pick or a shovel. What exactly would you like me to do? Well, I said to him, well, James, you are a very intelligent and resourceful man. What I would like you to do is to make your way into the enemy's encampment, to serve them as you are serving me, to bring them food and drink and whatnot. And all the while, I want you to listen to what they have to say. And he looked at me in that very odd way, and he said, do you want me to be a spy? I said, precisely. And thus, James would agree to serve as a spy. And some of that information that he was able to extract was vital in bringing us our victory during the Great War. Well, James, upon doing this, normally would be granted his freedom. For did not the Virginia legislature say that any slave who served in the Continental Army, upon the conclusion of the war, would be granted their freedom? Well, I came back in 1784 only to see James still enslaved. Well, this did not sit well with me. So I wrote a letter on his behalf to the Virginia legislature in Richmond Town, 21 November 1784. And as a result of that letter, James was granted his freedom. And as an honor, indeed, my friends, indeed, and as an honor to me, he decided to throw off the shackles of his former name, James Armistead, and adopt a new name. And that name would be James Lafayette. Indeed, friends, he was the man that I saw as I came off the ship. We embraced. I must admit, we wept. We reminisced about our experiences together. A grand moment indeed. But you know, my friends, now that I have returned, I am certainly reminded of all of my grand experiences here in America and what inspired me to cross the great ocean and to take part in this noble crusade. For friends, I first heard of this cause back in 1775. Oh, I was but a sous-lieutenant back then, a second lieutenant, newly promoted to the rank of captain. In truth, only because my father-in-law owned the regiment. It was a bit of a wedding gift. Well, there I had found myself billeted in the eastern part of France, in a city called Metz. And as was commonplace back then, we would often have these grandiose dinner parties with all of the most noble officers in attendance. And there we would typically speak about the various subjects of the day, perhaps a war that had begun, a war that had concluded, a new treaty that had been signed, perhaps a new innovation in strategy or in tactics. But on one occasion we had a very special guest, and this guest was none other than the Duke of Gloucester. Yes, that same name given to the route principale in the city of Williamsburg. And you might ask yourselves, well, who is this Duke of Gloucester? Well, he happens to be the brother to George III, the King of England. But unlike his brother, the King of England, the Duke of Gloucester was rather sympathetic to the American cause. In fact, many were of the opinion that he thought America should be free and independent. So we all listened in on what he had to say. Now, of those great officers present that evening, there was the famous Comte de Broglie. Many of you probably know that name very well from his exploits during the 7 Years' War. And do you know there were some who even said that he was going to be given command of the Continental Army in the place of General Washington. Now, the Comte de Broglie was a fine officer, to be sure, but I think we are all thankful that General Washington remained in command, are we not? It goes without saying. There was, of course, my beloved friend, le Baron de Kolb, the one man perhaps most responsible for bringing me here to America. I can still recall receiving the dispatch of the news of his death after the Battle of Camden in August of 1780. Most distressful to me, but even more so to the great cause of American freedom, for he was such a fine officer. There was, of course, the Chevalier de Buisson. Madame, the Chevalier de Buisson, I thought I recognized you. Oh, my dear friends, this is a rare coincidence, madame. You danced a minuet with the Chevalier. It was at the last of the Queen's birthday parties, was it not? Oh, come now, madame, you are being quite modest. You realize you are still the talk at Versailles. Oh, dear friends, she danced the most magnificent minuet I have ever seen dance before. Do you recall the name? Oh, how could you forget? It was called Le Dauphin. Perfectly stepped, not one error. Madam, you must have worked with your dance master for weeks, if not months. Oh, and upon conclusion of that perfect minuet, what did the Queen say to you? C'est magnifique. It is magnificent. And you know very well the Queen never gave compliments to anyone but herself. Madam, do you know, if only I could find a few musicians, we could all see an example of that minuet. Would you like that, my friends? Oh, alas, madame, who are we kidding? We'll never find any musicians awake before 6 p.m. Yes. Another time, madame. But rest assured, madame, you are still the talk at Versailles. Oh, forgive me, my friends. I have veered off the course of my story. Let me return. So, that evening, we spoke of many subjects. We spoke of the fighting at Lexington and at Concord, of the Grand Congress in Philadelphia, and of course of the great man himself, that of General Washington. So it was, by the conclusion of this meal, that I told my brother officers that I was ready and willing to fight, and if need be, die for this cause. Now I know what you're all thinking. Why, Monsieur le Marquis, why would you want to go and fight, and perhaps die, in another man's war? For France and England were not at war at that moment. Why would you want to risk yourself in such an endeavor? Well, I think you know the answer to that question. For this had been a war like none other in the history of man, had it not? This was a war of great ideas, of the freedom, even the liberation of mankind. A war that had embraced the ideas of the great thinkers of what we often refer to as this enlightened age, this age of reason. With men like Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Locke. And what were they speaking of? Representation in government, of an equality of mankind. That a man, no matter what class in society he might be born, whether he be black or white, Catholic or Protestant, rich or poor, slave or free, should not make a difference, but simply by the way in which that person would carry himself and prove himself in this world. My dear friends, after these 40 long years, are you still in agreement with these great ideas? Well, I am pleased to hear it, for as am I, and as I shall continue to be until my dying day. So that evening I rose up from my chair, I drew my sword, I came towards my host, the Comte de Broglie, and told him I was ready to put my colors to this great and noble cause. But alas, you know what he said to me? Sit down, Monsieur le Marquis. I believe you've had a bit too much wine this evening. But friends, of course it was not the wine. It was simply my enthusiasm for this great and noble cause. So what could I do? Well, I thought about it for some days, and then I said to myself, alas, I shall go to Versailles. I shall present myself at court in front of the King and Queen of France and ask them if I might have permission to go. So if I go to Versailles, presenting myself at court, asking the King and Queen if I can take part in this noble crusade, and what do they say to me? Give it a try, my friend. You've got a 50-50 chance. Bravo, something tells me you've heard my story before. Yes, one thing you must know about me, the Marquis de Lafayette, is that everyone, and I mean everyone, says no to me at least once. So the king responds with, oh, je regrette, monsieur le marquis, ce n'est pas possible. Je me montrerai quand la France et l'Angleterre ne sont pas en guerre. Je ne souhaite pas que vous en commenciez une. I'm sorry, monsieur le marquis, it is just not possible. It is indeed a rare time in French history where France and England are not actually at war. And I do not wish for you to start yet another war with that horrible nation of merchants, as we French used to refer to the English. Well, my friends, that should have been the end of it. For when the King and Queen of France say you cannot do something, well, of course you cannot. But I did the unthinkable. I disobeyed them. I left my regiment. I went to the western part of France, and there at the port city of Bordeaux, I purchased a ship fittingly called La Victoire, the victory. For that is what I was in search of, victory in this great cause. Well, of course, the King and Queen soon found out that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, had disobeyed them, and do you think they were pleased with this? Au contraire, quite displeased. In fact, so much so, they sent out soldiers to try and apprehend me. For if I was to be apprehended, of course I was to return back to my regiment at Metz, or worse, to my father-in-law at Marseille. So I had to act with the utmost secrecy, preparing all that I would need, a crew to man my ship, companions to join me, all of the supplies that I would need, for in truth I did not know when, or if I would even return back to France. Well, when all was prepared, the harbor master at Bordeaux inquired, "What is your destination, monsieur? Where are you headed?" He did not realize at that moment that I was the Marquis de Lafayette, for of course I had disguised myself. Young man, if you had to disguise yourself to wear a costume, and you wanted no one to know it was you, what might you wear? Yes, a difficult question. I had the luxury of 2 weeks to think upon it. And I did not have a group of 200 people staring at me. What do you think, my friend? You're not quite sure. Well, let me tell you a funny story. The English newspapers reported that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, disguised myself, are you ready? In a woman's gown. Can you imagine? Well, don't imagine that. Oh, do not believe everything you read or hear, especially if it is written by an Englishman about a Frenchman. No, instead I chose as my disguise to be a merchant, there to take part in a bit of commerce with the people of Spain. So not having any issue with this, they of course allowed me to pass, and true to my word, I did go from France to Spain, but what would be my ultimate destination? America, exactement. Now this journey took me 8 long weeks. Has anyone ever been to sea for 8 long weeks? Indeed, I know you have, my friend, and I thank you for your service. I will tell you this. I am glad that I joined the French army and not the French Navy simply because I was seasick nearly every day of my journey. But after 8 long weeks, as I looked over the bow of my ship, I could see the Americas for the first time. And we had landed at a place called Yorktown in South Carolina. How I recall that evening perfectly well, for even though it was evening, the moon was so bright that it illuminated everything that we looked upon. So as I put my foot upon American soil for the first time and met you, the good people of the United States, well, what do you think my first impressions were of you, the people of the United States of America? It's better not to answer that question. Friends, it was not a very good one. For the first Americans I met here, in America, tried to kill me. Not a good start, is it? We had landed at the plantation of a Monsieur Auger, a Benjamin Huger, or they pronounce it Ougie there in South Carolina, an ardent patriot, but he had mistaken me and my companions for Englishmen. Can you imagine, madame, mistaking me for an Englishman? Do you know, in hindsight, I don't think the moon really was that bright. Well, I quickly assured them that we were not. We were there to help them in their great and glorious cause, and once they realized this, they welcomed us with open arms. But, friends, we were not there upon a holiday, were we? We needed to make our way as quickly as possible to Philadelphia City. So, after bidding farewell, after thanking them for their kindness, hospitality, and for not killing us, we began that long journey northwards. It took us several weeks, but eventually I would arrive in Philadelphia City, the largest city in former English North America, and its 40,000 souls. Now, my friends, before I had departed France, I had met with an American agent, a representative named Silas Dean from Connecticut. And he was giving out what we call promissory notes. And as the name implies, it promised something. In my case, it promised that if I, the Marquis de Lafayette, were to come to America, I would be granted the rank of Major General in the American Army. So there I was, promissory note in hand, and I approached your Congress. I said to them, honor me so by granting me a command in the Continental Army that I too might fight against tyranny. And now what does Congress say to me? No. You're doing great. Yes, I'm going to take you with me next time. They say, thank you for coming, Monsieur le Marquis. We appreciate you offering your services, but we don't need, nor do we even want your help. Now, can you imagine this, my friends? What I had endured up to that moment? I had left my regiment, I had disobeyed the King and Queen of France, I had traveled 8 long weeks at sea, seasick nearly every day. I had nearly been killed by the first Americans I met here in America. I had traveled from South Carolina all the way to Philadelphia in the month of July, just to be told by your members of Congress to return back to France. Well, I ask all of you, what would you have done? Would you have returned back to France? No. Of course not. You would persevere, you would overcome, you would triumph in the end, just as I had done. So again, I made that attempt to Congress, saying, very well, you will not give me a command of soldiers, but perhaps you will allow me to serve as an aide-de-camp to General Washington, as an assistant to the great man. And again, they say to me, I'm sorry, Monsieur le Marquis, but once again, this is just not possible. Besides, we don't have enough money to pay you. Well, dear friends, I finally said boldly to your members of Congress, then I shall serve at my own expense. And would you know it? With those immortal words, your Congress immediately made me a Major General. I could not imagine this good fortune. Oh, indeed, back in France, I was but a captain in the French army, and a newly promoted one at that, again, because of my father-in-law. But here in America, I was made a Major General, a General of Division. I could command upwards of 5,000 soldiers, yet I never commanded more than 50 in my entire life. And all at the age of 19. Well, dear friends, good fortune would follow me again. For that very next evening, the people of Philadelphia were holding a ball for General Washington, a party. You know all about parties, don't you, madame? But this one held in honor of General Washington for defending the city of brotherly love. I recall when he walked into the room, for I knew precisely who he was before he spoke, even though we had never met before. It was simply by the way in which he carried himself. For to me, he was truly an aristocrat without the name, a nobleman without the title. He came forth, he held out his hand, he said to me, I thank you, Monsieur le Marquis, for coming to support this cause. Think of this new place as your new home. Think of the officers around you as your new family, and think of me as your new friend. And with this, I could not help myself. I immediately embraced him. I think I might have embarrassed him a bit with my French custom. But I said to him, from now on, mon général, j'ai deux patries, la France et les États-Unis d'Amérique. From now on, I shall have 2 countries, France and the United States of America. And thus, my great adventure had begun. Now, my friends, it was not to be all merriment, all parties, all minuets. Indeed not. There was a war to be fought. And I would have my first taste of it at a place called Brandywine in Pennsylvania. Now, I had no soldiers under my direct command just yet, but in the midst of the fray, General Washington turned to me and he said, General Lafayette, General Sullivan's division is beginning to crumble and retreat. I want you to ride up to them and push them back on line. I immediately drew my sword and went into the fray. I did my best to encourage them, but they ran right by me. I wheeled my horse around, and at that precise moment, a musket ball found my leg. My boot began to fill with blood, overflow with blood. In fact, I thought I was going to be killed in my first engagement. But I kept my courage. I kept my strength long enough to rally those men and to push them back on line. General Washington would lose the battle that day. It was September the 11th, 1777. But he was able to save the army. And as long as the army remained, the great cause of American freedom remained. As for me, well, the wound had the best of me. I would be taken from the field by stretcher, then by cart, even for weeks by boat. And, well, do you know where I found myself? Not Virginia, Not heaven, no. Not even France, my dear, but rather Bethlehem. And not the Holy Land, I had not died. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I had been nursed back to health by the lovely Moravian girls there. I dare say, were it not for them, I would have lost my leg, perhaps my life. Well, weeks pass, and General Washington sends me a dispatch saying, Monsieur le Marquis, I'm so pleased to hear that you are recovering so very well, but you have been away from the field for these many weeks. What exactly is keeping you there in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania? I immediately wrote back saying, Mon Général, you obviously have never met these lovely Moravian girls. But please, do not think ill of me, or certainly not of these lovely young ladies. It was their devotion to God, to this great cause, and to me, that kept me alive, that saved my leg, and enabled me to continue on in this great struggle. For friends, you know well, there was a dark cloud approaching. General Washington had just given the order to march into what we call winter quarters. Some of you refer to it as the bloody footsteps in the snow, others simply as Valley Forge. Now, my dear friends, when you decided to declare for independence in July of 1776, did all of you here in former English North America wish to be free and independent from England? No. Bravo, my friend. Yes, no, you did not. In fact, many have said, to include John Adams, that it is but 1/3 of the population only that wish to be free and independent from England. Well, my mathematics have never been very good, but I know that leaves 2/3 of the population remaining. And of that 2/3, a full third wish to remain loyal to King George, and they would fight dearly for him. And that remaining third, well, they were undecided. They wanted to go see what was going to happen next and thus follow suit. So, with 1/3 of the population only, made up of not great warriors just yet, but rather farmers and tradesmen and shopkeepers, they were ready to take up arms and fight against one of the strongest powers on this planet. Why, my friends? Why did they do it? Why did you do it? For many reasons, but because you believed in this great and noble idea. You believed in your Declaration of Independence, and you believed in General Washington, that he would persevere, that he would overcome, that he would triumph in the end, even at the cost of his own life. It was a cause worth fighting for. It was a cause worth dying for. So thus we marched into Valley Forge, and many thought we would never march out again. But good news would soon come. First in the form of a victory. Rare news back then. This in the sovereign state of New York at a place called Saratoga. 5,000 of the enemy would be taken there, a grand victory indeed. Second, with the birth of the new year, many foreign officers like myself flocked to the American banner, and there they would lend their expertise in the American army. One such man was a German officer, Prussian to be exact, his name Baron von Steuben. In fact, monsieur, I remember you from the winter encampment. You remember Baron von Steuben, don't you? You know, he could not speak English very well, but I believe he could use profanity in every other language. And maybe that inspired you to learn the drill a bit quicker. But thirdly, my friends, and perhaps most importantly, it would be my country of France that would change the nature of this war. France would be the first nation to recognize the United States of America as its own free and independent nation. And then she declared war upon England. So, my friends, it had gone from a revolt, a rebellion, a civil war of sorts, to a world war, in which battles would now be fought across the globe, in the subcontinent of India, in Africa, in the West Indies, in Europe itself, and of course right here in the North American continent. So it was a difficult task for England to fight and to put down this rebellion. So she would have to change her strategy, and her new strategy was thus. She took a small but highly professional army and sent it to the south, where she felt she would find that most loyalist support. She raised up new regiments, provisional regiments like the Queen's Rangers, British Legion, American Legion, and that would help her to put down this rebellion. She also solicited the help of the German states of the Holy Roman Empire, specifically that of Hesse-Kassel, Hesse-Darmstadt, the free cities of Hanau, Frankfurt, and of course Brandenburg. And these Hessians would come and serve right alongside their English masters. And this plan, sadly, worked very well at first. For we all recall reading about the losses at Savannah in 79, the lost fall of Charleston in May of 1780, the lesser engagements around that city like Monk's Corner and the Blackstocks, the massacre at the Waxhaws in the May of 1780, the debacle at Camden in August of 1780. That list went on and on. We did not think we would see the year 1781, but it came. and with it good news. For General Washington would dispatch me, the Marquis de Lafayette, right here to Virginia. He gave me 3 tasks. First, well, it was to capture a man we all once called a friend. Do you know of whom I speak? Yes, I know you're all hesitant to even utter it. In fact, Washington would never speak his name again, simply referring to him as the traitor. But you are correct. Benedict Arnold, a man who once served so valiantly for this cause. At Quebec in 75, at Valcour Island in 76, was perhaps responsible for the twin victories at Saratoga in 77. But he betrayed the cause. For what? English gold? English command? Well, his new masters had sent him here to Virginia, and I was to capture him and bring him to justice. My second task, it tied in with the first, I was to prevent the enemy, whomever might command, from capturing all of the vitally needed supplies that were to be found here in this breadbasket of North America, as Virginia was commonly called. For many of you Virginians will understand that for the most part, Virginia had remained untouched throughout the war, since the departure of the last of the royal governors, John Murray IV, Earl of Dunmore. So all of its foodstuffs, military supplies, livestock could all be used for the war effort, whomever could get their hands upon it. I was to stop them. And thirdly, when General Washington gave the order, I was to take my newly formed light infantry division and march it northwards to New York, to assist him and the French commander, General Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, le Comte de Rochambeau, in their assault upon Manhattan. Well, my friends, by the time I, General Lafayette, began my campaign on the 14th day of March, 1781, I really could not complete the first part of my task, for General Benedict Arnold would not remain overly long. He would soon be replaced by General Phillips, and then ultimately by Lord Cornwallis himself, the most capable of the English commanders. And we began fighting a cat-and-mouse campaign all summer long. Unfortunately, I was the mouse the majority of the time. Battles such as Point of Fork, Spencer's Ordinary, Green Springs Plantation. But by the 3rd week of August, I would receive the dispatch that I had longed for. It had come from Washington. He informed me that he was preparing to march southwards, not to attack New York City, as initially planned, but instead to come all the way to the Tidewater of Virginia, where he might gain the advantage against our enemy, Lord Cornwallis, who had placed himself here in Yorktown. And of course, he would not be alone. The Grand French Army would be with him, commanded by General Rochambeau. He had arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, July the 10th and the 11th of 1780. So these soldiers began their march southwards, and before they even set foot upon Virginia soil, a great victory had been achieved. But this one was at sea. The French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, normally guarding the lucrative sugar islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint-Domingue, had entered into the Chesapeake by request of Rochambeau. He requested him to arrive at the end of August. I like saying this story because he arrived on the 30th of August. He kept his word. And but a few short days later, on the 5th of September, an English fleet came to intercept them under Admiral Graves. They would fight the Battle of the Chesapeake, or better known as the Battle of the Capes. And the French were victorious! What did this mean, my friends? This meant that Lord Cornwallis was now trapped here at Yorktown with no possibility of escape by sea or resupply by sea. It would be simply a question of time. Washington and Rochambeau and the lead elements of their armies would arrive in the hamlet of Williamsburg on the 14th day of September, 1781, and each day thereafter, more and more bataillons, regiments, brigades, and divisions would arrive until they amassed 21,000 soldiers. They marched upon Yorktown, they surrounded this place, they dug their parallel lines, they pushed their guns in place. By the 9th of October, Washington began the bombardment, and that bombardment would not end until victory was assured. On the evening of the 14th of October, Washington realized that he needed to seize 2 earthen fortifications on the extreme left flank of Cornwallis's lines. They were simply called Redoubts 9 and 10. Being that this was a joint operation betwixt French and American forces, one would be assaulted by the French, Redoubt 9, and one by the Americans, Redoubt 10. Now, friends, remember, even though I am a Frenchman, I had the honor and privilege of commanding American soldiers, and the assault force would come from my division. So I had selected as the commander of this attack a man who had been with me from the beginning. His name, Colonel Gima, a Frenchman in American uniform like myself, but my dear friend, Alexander Hamilton. Well, he wanted that command more than anyone. So he did what we call in military circles, he went over my head and went to Washington and begged and pleaded that he might have that honor. And I don't think Washington could deny Hamilton anything at all. So Hamilton was given that command. So under cover of darkness, with unloaded muskets, to make the soldiers put their trust in the bayonet, they stormed redoubts 9 and 10. And Alexander took 10 so quickly, he had the audacity to send a messenger to the French redoubt and ask them if they needed any help. Of which they, of course, responded, no merci, no thank you. And the French shortly thereafter would take the 9th redoubt. Indeed, we were now firing point blank into the enemy's position. Cornwallis, of course, had one last attempt to escape. He thought if he crosses the river with the small boats he had at his disposal, he could break out by land in Gloucester Point. This is the narrowest point betwixt the two. But perhaps proving that God is not an Englishman, a great storm rose up and scattered all of his boats. He had no other choice but surrender. And as you know, my dear friends, on this day, the 19th of October, 1781, is the day we won at Yorktown! Ah, so long ago. Do you realize, my friends, the last time I saw His Excellency General Washington was 1784. We spent 2 glorious weeks together at his beloved Mount Vernon, there reflecting upon the war and the future of this nation. We rode on to a place called Annapolis in Maryland, said goodbye to some of the officers we had the honor and privilege to have served with during the war, and then onwards to a place called Marlborough in Maryland, and that is where I would say my goodbyes. But not before the General would say this to me. He said, Monsieur le Marquis, I truly believe that the easy part was winning this war. I could not imagine he would say such a thing after all of the trials and tribulations we had been through. But he explained himself further by saying, I do believe that the much more difficult part will be for these 13 former colonies that have now formed 13 United States, well, getting along with one another, surviving into the future. Well, dear friends, look at how far you have gone. From 13 to 24 United States, you have endured war, civil strife, turmoil, yet you have endured. And why is that? Well, I dare say it is because of the foundation that was built at the price of so much sacrifice and blood by you, the American patriot. In fact, I will go further. I will say one day this nation shall serve as a beacon for all other nations to look to as the truest example of freedom and of independence. God bless you all, my dear friends, and God bless this great nation of the United States of America. I thank you, my dear friends, and I thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to listen to my story. And I am hopeful in the last few minutes remaining that some of you might have some questions or curiosities of me and my life, that I might be able to enlighten you a bit about my life of the past, present, or as always, hopes for the future. So I open the floor to all of you to what questions or curiosities you might have of me, the Marquis de Lafayette.
If you have a question, let me bring the microphone to you so we can record this, please.
Hello, madame.
I understood that your wife was pregnant when you left, and I was just wondering how you handled that.
The voice of reason speaks. Yes, indeed, madame. So, when I decided to come to America, when I became so inspired, my wife, Adrienne, again, we have been married since April the 11th of 1774. You see, I have not forgotten my anniversary. When I was 16 and she was 14. So as you can imagine, it is what we call in the French aristocracy an arranged marriage, very much like a business transaction, in which, for example, one family might have a great and noble name that stretches back the centuries, but they have lost their fortune. Happens more often than not. They might look for a family with not such a great name, but a great fortune, so they can mutually benefit. In the case of my marriage, not only did we both come from 2 great and noble names, the Lafayette and de Noailles families, we came from 2 great fortunes, and on top of all of that, madame, it was a marriage of love as well. So indeed, this is where I will lose all of you ladies. So my wife was aware I wanted to go, but I did not exactly tell her when I was going and for how long I was going. And I was gone initially for 2 years. But no doubt all of you ladies would be equally as supportive of your husbands if they departed for 2 years, wouldn't you? No need to respond to that one. No, and as a result, you are correct. Our first child, Henriette, was actually born in 1775, and, well, tragically, she passed while I was here. But my wife was pregnant with my second child, Anastasia, and she has lived to adulthood and it fares well at the moment. And indeed, upon my return in 79, my son, George Washington Lafayette, would be born, if you ever doubt my allegiance to the great man. And our youngest is named Marie-Antoinette Virginie, though in the unpleasantness of the French Revolution, we stopped using the name Marie-Antoinette and simply used the name Virginie, which was a recommendation by your newly appointed ambassador to France, Thomas Jefferson, in 1784, the year of her birth. And of course, he could not choose any other name but Virginie as a result. So yes, she was, but this is what I will say of that. Never has a man had a more loving and devoted wife than my beloved Adrienne. Thank you for bringing her to everyone's attention, madame. Any other questions? Yes, young man.
Did you actually try to kill the beast of Gévaudan?
Oh. The young man asks, did I really try to go and kill the beast of Gévaudan? What he is referencing is that in the region of France that I am from, which is called the Auvergne, it is somewhat of a mountainous region, and there was a legend that there was some sort of a monster or beast, la bête de Gévaudan, as we call it in France, that was killing people. Upwards of over 100 people died as a result. And we did not even know what type of beast this was. But it turns out that the beast was actually a wolf. And not just one wolf, but several different wolves that were causing this. But I did take my father's musket, and with my companions, we did go into the hills of the Gévaudan in search of that beast. But unfortunately, I was not the one who was able to slay the beast of the Gévaudan. But if you ever go to that region, and have you been to that region, my friend? Well, go one day. You will see that on nearly every sign, there is a wolf symbolic of that region. Well done. Keep up your studies, my friend. Yes, madame.
How did you feel about...
I can't hear you, madame.
I know. Everyone else, how did you feel about France's own revolution as compared to the United States and your witness to that?
Absolutely. So Madame's question was in regards to the different revolutions. How did I feel about the revolution that occurred in France? First of all, the American Revolution and the French Revolution are two very different revolutions. In fact, you begin your revolution with a declaration of independence. You stated that you wanted to be a free and separate nation. In France, we had much more of a social revolution, in which we did not necessarily want to leave France, we wanted to alter the monarchy. The vast majority of the 24 million Frenchmen living in 1789 were somewhat content with the king as the chief executive, but they wanted more representation, so something called a constitutional monarchy, in which we Frenchmen thought we would have the best of both worlds. We could preserve the king as that chief executive, but create a legislative body, not unlike your Congress or the English Parliament. In France, we call it an Assemblée nationale, or elected representatives of the people, to speak on behalf of the people. Because up to that moment, madame, France had an absolute monarchy in which the king ruled absolutely. So he surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear and not what he needed to hear. So with a constitutional monarchy, you would have these representatives that would report to the National Assembly and tell the king of your plight. So if a region is starving, they will be fed. If a new bridge needs to be constructed to add to commerce, it will be built. If bandits need to be eradicated in the outlying provinces, it will be done. But this could not be done unless the king altered the monarchy. And the people spoke for themselves. On the 14 juillet, the 14th of July, 1789, 80,000 Parisians of a city of 650,000 rose up in revolt and struck at the symbol of tyranny, which was the Bastille, or the Bastille. The Bastille was once a fortress in the 14th century, but it had been converted into a prison. But a prison not for your common criminal, but instead for those who spoke out against the injustice of government. For example, the great Voltaire, that philosopher, had spent some time within the Bastille. So it became symbolic of that tyranny. So by storming it and destroying it, you are destroying this tyranny. That is why I would send the key to President Washington, that he too would be able to unlock this injustice that is occurring throughout the world. And many people felt that the formation of a constitutional monarchy would be the best for all citizens of France. The king was a bit hesitant. I would write a document in August of 1789 called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And this document would, in essence, serve as the preamble to all French constitutions. I had the assistance of my dear friend Thomas Jefferson, who was living in Paris at that time, to assist me. And in this document, we spoke of those natural rights of mankind that all people, regardless of the nation they come from, should be able to enjoy. Some of those rights being life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, freedom from oppression, and this would be adopted. And the king finally would adopt the constitutional monarchy on the 6th of October, 1789. But not everyone in France was content with a monarchy. In fact, many were of the opinion that France should form a republic, like you have. A republic is not a bad thing, but it is the way in which that republic was declared. For the republic would be declared in August of 1792. The king and queen of France would be arrested for crimes against the state and sent to a new device known as the Louisette. Yes, you were thinking something else, weren't you? It was initially called the Louisette. Doesn't sound so foreboding, does it? But a doctor that spoke out against it was a Dr. Guillotin. He didn't like capital punishment, but he wanted a more humane way of execution, so thus his name was applied to this new device, the Louisette, and it became known as the guillotine. So, madame, when you execute what is arguably the most powerful monarchs in all of the world, it makes the rest of the monarchs of the world rather nervous. So they all invaded France. I was in favor of the constitutional monarchy, so I grew very unpopular. Some of those great revolutionaries, like Danton, Saint-Just, Marat, and Robespierre, were calling for me to go to Paris. And undoubtedly, I would have met that device, the guillotine. So instead, myself and my staff and my family fled into the Austrian Netherlands, which you might call Belgium. And there we were arrested by the Austrians. You can understand the Austrians were rather displeased with the French at that moment. Remember, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was of the Habsburg line, the Austrian line. So, as an example, I was imprisoned and not allowed my parole, my word that I would not take part in any more hostile actions. So, madame, I remained in prison from October of 1792 until 1797. I spent the vast majority of that time in the fortress of Olmütz, in the heart of Moravia, in the Austrian Empire. When my wife, Adrienne, and my two daughters, for my son, George Washington, had been sent to President Washington and grew up at Mount Vernon, when my wife could not get me released, she voluntarily joined me in prison with my two daughters. Eventually, because of the success of a young French general named Bonaparte, defeating the Austrians in northern Italy, he marched to Vienna, and the Treaty of Campo Formio would be signed. And one of the stipulations in that treaty was that I, the Marquis de Lafayette, would be released. I was not even permitted to return back to France. I had to remain in the Netherlands myself, because I would have had to have sworn allegiance to the new government. And the French governments were changing left and right at that moment. The new government was called the Directoire, headed by Paul Barras. And I refused to swear my allegiance, so I remained there until Bonaparte performed his coup d'etat of the 9th of November, 1799. And then I snuck back into France. Bonaparte wanted me to serve his regime, but I did not believe in the course he was taking. I still believed in that constitutional monarchy and the restoration of the monarchy. So I would retire to private life while Bonaparte became emperor of the French until 1815 and his fall, and then I would return back to politics with the restoration of Louis XVIII, Louis XVIII. So our revolution was very much incomplete, madame, as you can imagine. Yes, there were some strides that were made for the betterment of mankind and the citizens of France, but there is always more that needs to be done. Other questions? There was a young one over here I saw. Did you have a question, my dear? You were just stretching, of course. Yes, I understand. Yes, madame.
What is your favorite souvenir of your time in America?
What is my favorite souvenir of my time in America? The meeting of General Washington. I have the greatest respect and honor for General Washington. Do you know, madame, I believe General Washington, President Washington, Washington himself, the man, is Cincinnatus reborn. Many of you might not be familiar with that Roman Cincinnatus of the 6th century BC. Cincinnatus was a great soldier, but he loved more than anything to till the soil, to be a farmer. But when the Roman Republic was in danger of being overrun, they called upon Cincinnatus to lead the armies of that republic. So he put down his plow, he drew his sword, he picked up his shield, and he led the soldiers of Rome. And he defeated all of Rome's enemies. And when that was complete, many of the people of Rome said, well, why don't you put the crown on your head? Why don't you become king or emperor? Well, he put away his sword, he put down his shield, and he returned back to his home, stating that he would always serve the republic, but never be its master. Madam, did not Washington do the same? When called upon to lead the Continental Army, he left his beloved Mount Vernon. And he drew his sword, and he vanquished the enemies of the United States of America. And when that was complete, many of you stated, why don't you put the crown upon your head? And Washington responded, North America is done with kings. And he went back to his beloved Mount Vernon to till the soil, stating, echoing Cincinnatus, that he would always serve this republic and never be its master. And when you called upon him to be president of the United States, not once but twice, he answered the call. In truth, I believe that when men are offered power, they take it readily and in fact would want more. To me, it's the greater man who does not want the power, but yet serves the citizens around him. That is Washington, and that is my greatest souvenir, is meeting with and serving with that great man.
Excuse me. When did you
I'll get you next, my
when
friend.
did you elect to get dirt from Bunker Hill and take it to your eventual cemetery in Paris?
Monsieur is perhaps accelerating my death, but that's what he is referencing is that when I was up at Boston, when I went to Boston and then Quincy, where of course John Adams resides, but I also went when I was in Boston to the place that the Battle of Bunker or Breed's Hill was fought. Of course, I was not present for that battle. It was fought in June of 1775, but I was there for the laying of the cornerstone of the grand obelisk monument that is present there. So symbolically, I took earth from that monument and I put it in a chest, put it on board the ship, and it is my wish, my request, my desire that upon my demise, monsieur, that I shall be buried in that soil. So though I will be buried in France at Picpus Cemetery, where my wife sadly is interred, and her family as well, I will be buried in France, but in American soil. And it would be my greatest desire that a French and American flag would fly perpetually over my grave. So, but I'm not ready to die just yet, monsieur. Yes, other questions? Oh, yes, my friend, of course.
I understand that these gentlemen officers, after the surrender, sort of got together. And I read a story about how Cornwallis actually bought George Armstrong a drink. Is that true?
Oh, Armistead, you mean? Yes. So what occurred after the surrender? Of course, the English surrender on the 19th of October, and Cornwallis was actually not present. Of course, he told us he wasn't feeling well. I wouldn't be feeling well either. But regardless, I would meet with him the next day. And when Cornwallis entered into my tent, next to me was James Armistead. And when Cornwallis saw him, he said, "James, you have done me a mischief." He realized what James had been doing, that he was spying upon him. And I did not see a drink being given to him, but I would freely and gladly give James that drink himself for what he had done during the war. But that is true, we did all meet in the same tent after the siege of Yorktown. It is. I could see how upset Cornwallis was.
Marquis,
Yes.
I understand you were beloved by your American soldiers for several reasons. You spent your own money helping them with food and uniforms and armaments. But also I understand that you were quite resourceful at the Battle of Barren Hill, where you climbed the church steeple and saw you were surrounded by 3 different British generals. Is that correct? Are you aware of what I'm...
Yes, of course I am, monsieur. I was at the battle. So, What my dear friend is referencing, he says some very kind words in regards to the fact that I had spent so much money of my own upon my soldiers. It was a necessity, really. That is what they needed. I spent upwards of 167,000 French livres on the war effort. But at the Battle of Baron Hill, which was fought on the 20th day of May, 1778, was just outside the city of Philadelphia. Washington had ordered that I observe the enemy's movements. They were under the command of General Howe. General Howe was getting ready to leave theaters of operation to be replaced by General Clinton as supreme commander of all English forces in North America. So Washington cautioned me, and he said, I want you to observe the enemy's movement with your brigade of 2,000 men, but do not remain overly long at any one spot, for the English have as many as 12,000 soldiers in the city of Philadelphia, and they could destroy you. So unfortunately, I paid no mind to what Washington said to me. And I remained not one, not two, but 3 days in the same position, there upon a prominent outlook point called Baron Hill. Now, as the name implies, it was free of trees, so I could see Philadelphia perfectly, but Philadelphia could see me perfectly as well. So on that third day, as I observed the approach of the enemy in 3 columns, one was enveloping my right flank, one was enveloping my left flank, and one was circumnavigating my position to attack me from the rear. Now, newly appointed to my command were 50 Oneida and Tuscarora Indians. I had gone up to Albany to lead an invasion of Canada, but there were several problems with that. The Canadians did not want to become American, and 2, there were not sufficient soldiers to mount such an invasion. So instead, I negotiated a treaty on behalf of the Americans with members of the Oneida. And so they decided to come and serve alongside me, because not only did I negotiate a treaty, but they adopted me into their tribe. So believe it or not, monsieur, I am Oneida, as well as the Marquis, as well as General Lafayette. And my Oneida name is Kuailea, which means great warrior. I must admit that does not bother my ego in the least. But regardless, these 50 Oneida, I dispersed to cover our retreat, and some light infantry as well. And those Oneida and Tuscarora warriors fought so valiantly. In fact, they saved my command. As we traveled through a narrow causeway to escape back to the winter encampment at Valley Forge, 9 of their warriors gave their life for our defense. Yes, it was my error. It was my responsibility for remaining overly long, but it was their valor that saved us that day at Baron Hill. As if I didn't remember.
We have time for one more question.
Can you speak a little bit about the Baron von Steuben and his great contributions?
Absolutely, madame. Madame's question in regards to Baron von Steuben, or General von Steuben, who had come to serve the American cause. Now, Baron von Steuben had been introduced to Silas Deane and Benjamin Franklin back in Paris, and they gave him letters of recommendation. And Baron von Steuben had served in the great Prussian army of King Frederick II. We must remember that that is the greatest army in the world, Frederick the Great being the greatest general of his time. So any officer that had served in the Prussian army would be welcome to train another army. So when Baron von Steuben came to the winter encampment at Valley Forge, Washington tasked him with creating a new manual for the American soldiers to adopt. Because the problem up to that point, madame, is that many officers were using different manuals. Some battalion commanders would be using a manual of French origin from the 1740s. Some would be using a regimental commander from an English manual from the 1760s. Some would create their own manuals. So when these soldiers are being deployed upon a battlefield from the company level to the battalion level to the regimental level to the brigade level to the division level, it is like a Tower of Babel and takes 5 times as long for them to deploy. By having one manual, whether you are a platoon commander or divisional commander, you will know the manual in and out, and it will all be the same. And that is what Baron von Steuben was tasked with. So when he began his training, he formed what he called a model company. He took a sergeant, or a Feldwebel as he called them in German, from each one of the parent companies and would train them as one. Once they mastered the manual, they would return back to their company and train the remainder of that company until the entirety of the Continental Army was using this manual and were able to fight in the European style. The proof would be in the pudding, and that would be at the Battle of Monmouth. on 28 June 1778, where oddly enough we fought against Lord Cornwallis. A very hot day, but Washington and Cornwallis would fight throughout that hot day, and though some call it a draw, we would have the strategic victory because Cornwallis would retreat after that battle. So we took the worst the enemy had, and we were able to stand and remain there upon the battlefield, and that is because of Baron von Steuben. Now, Baron von Steuben, of course, would serve throughout the entirety of the war. In fact, he would precede me here to Virginia, starting to form the nucleus of the Light Infantry Division. The problem was with that is that, well, Baron von Steuben really never mastered the English language. And you really don't want to send a Prussian officer to demand recruiting in Virginia, because Virginians don't like to be told what to do. So another reason why Washington dispatched me to assume command of the Light Infantry Division. But indeed, his contributions in the form of discipline and training were really a great part in the victory during the war.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We've got a few announcements we're going to take care of. This is history the way it should be lived.
I thank you,
This
my
was
friend.
it.
And my friends, I would like to just conclude with one more thing. I am a firm believer that all of the answers to the future can be found in the past if we study our history. And by you hosting such wonderful opportunities such as this to talk about history, you enable us to continue to tell those stories of the past, that God willing, we are going to make better citizens of the future. So thank you so much for having me here today.